I want to go further into the topic of myths. I've recently been reading Yuval's recent book Nexus, and he spends a lot of it as he's exploring how the history of information, how myths have played a role in that, from the Jewish tradition of Passover to me being a Catholic, and how Jesus was created by the church based on likely a rabbi with a smaller following, but they used that image of his life to create a whole church around it. And I showed you before we got on this book, The Power of Myth, which I love reading, by Joseph Campbell.
Right.
And I started reading this when I was in my mid 30s because at this time I was going through this intense study of the Bible called Discipleship 1, 2, and 3. And what I found was that I was having a very hard time interpreting the Bible. And luckily, I had a pastor at the time who had a degree in theology, but he also had a PhD in history. And he would take the myths from the Bible and he'd present them to us in modern day times so that we could cross that bridge, so to speak. And one of the things I think Joseph Campbell says, or the way I interpret it in this book, is part of the reason people are losing connection to some of the religions is because the myths no longer apply to them in modern day, meaning they're based on cultures from thousands of years ago, and people are having a hard time understanding the myths and applying it to modern day life. Do you think that bears true in any way?
Well, I think you talk about myth, and just to take one quick step back, I think, and maybe your audience has heard this term before. One thing I always like to emphasize is that when we talk about myth, we're not talking about things that are inherently false, which is pejorative concept of that we talk about myths today, the myths of dieting or whatever, but really are about profound stories that have a great deal of importance in helping us to understand ourselves and helping us to understand our world. And I think, to your point, it is challenging when we have stories that originate 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, to be able to completely keep up with modern times. And I think there's a lot of elements that certainly do, but there become challenges, and especially moral questions, is when you look at like the medical sciences and what we're able to do and which we weren't able to do 1,000 years ago. So we now have the ability to think about, well, how do we keep people alive, or should we do transplants, or like these are questions that just weren't part of the ability to even ask those kinds of questions before. We can extrapolate, we can think about those things, and sometimes they were able to find that path that helps us to make that kind of connection, and it can work for people very well. But there are certainly a lot of people who struggle with that and who really have difficulty trying to understand the ideas and the stories that they were brought up with, that they are now using to try to understand the world as it is. And some people are able to figure out how to make those connections very well and very clearly. Other people are not. And again, that's where it could be very interesting to be. My guess is it's going to be a pretty complicated and multifactorial issue for people. But I think that there could be some very interesting abilities to look at that. And for people who figured out how to make it work, what's going on in their brain? Do they look at things more nuanced, more complex, less complex? How are they? Do they bring a different kind of emotionality to it? Are they more emotional, less emotional? So there's a lot of interesting aspects to that. But again, part of the interesting, and I don't know if this is another answer to your question, but part of what I find fascinating about some of the discussions about the research looking at things like religiosity itself is that we all have different cognitive and emotional domains that we bring to our view of the world. And there isn't really a right or a wrong one. If somebody looks at the world more emotionally or less emotionally than somebody else, is it right to be more emotional? Well, sometimes it is. It can be good to be more emotional. Maybe it helps you to make a connection. Maybe it helps you to be, I'm a doctor. Maybe it helps you to be a better doctor because you make an emotional connection with your patients. On the other hand, maybe for some people it's worse because now you're emotionally connected. Now you can't look at them in as an objective way as possible. So maybe for some people being emotional makes you a better doctor, and for some people being emotional makes you a worse doctor. It's always this adaptability piece, which I think is quite challenging and quite interesting, that there isn't an inherently right or wrong way to be, and whether, again, more emotional, less emotional, more cognitive, less cognitive, but it's what works for each person. And then whether or not they are able to find a way to be able to make that more adaptive, make that connection so that they understand themselves. It goes back to what we were talking at the beginning, how they understand themselves, how they understand the world, and are they able to do that with whatever perspective that they decide to take. And if they are, then that's great, and they can be very adaptive and productive. On the other hand, if their sense of the world, if their sense of meaning and purpose is not going well, then how do they revise that? How do they come to a different way of looking at things? And history is full of people who thought they were going to do one thing in life and then wound up doing another. And history is also full of people who thought they were going to do one thing in life, and that's exactly what they did. There isn't a right or wrong, which is, I think, maybe the most important thing to realize.